The gunshot that rang out across Clara Sullivan's tiny shack at 3 in the morning was not what drove her barefoot into the pre-dawn darkness of San Jose, California, in 1882, but rather the gnawing hunger that had kept her awake for the third night in a row. She wrapped her threadbare shawl around her shoulders and slipped through the broken door, her stomach cramping with such ferocity that shame seemed a luxury she could no longer afford. The henhouse belonging to Thomas Calloway sat just beyond the property line, a squat wooden structure that promised salvation in the form of fresh eggs, and Clara moved toward it like a ghost, her feet silent against the dirt path that separated desperation from survival. Thomas had been awake for hours, as he often was these days, nursing a cup of bitter coffee in the main house while watching the horizon begin its slow transformation from black to deep purple. His ranch sprawled across 200 acres of California grassland, a modest operation by some standards, but his entire world nonetheless, built with his own calloused hands after the war had spit him out broken and searching for meaning. He was 26 years old, and felt twice that most mornings, the weight of solitude pressing down on his broad shoulders like an invisible yoke. When he heard the soft clucking of disturbed hens, he set down his cup with careful precision and reached for the lantern, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that survival often depended on swift, silent action. Clara's fingers trembled as she reached into the nesting box, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might wake the entire town. The egg was warm against her palm, smooth and perfect, and tears pricked at her eyes as she placed it carefully into the fold of her shawl. She had been 21 years old when her husband died 6 months ago, thrown from a spooked horse outside the mill where he worked, leaving her with nothing but debt, and a landlord who grew more menacing with each passing week. The second egg joined the first, then a third, and she was reaching for a fourth when the lantern light flooded the henhouse interior, freezing her in place like a deer caught in a hunter's sight. "Well now," Thomas said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Guess you are pretty hungry." Clara spun around, clutching her shawl against her chest, the eggs pressing into her ribs. Her face burned with shame so acute it felt physical, a scorching heat that spread from her cheeks down her neck. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to beg, but no words came. In the golden light of the lantern, she could see him clearly for the first time, this man whose property she had violated. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held something she could not quite name. Not anger, as she had expected, but something softer, something that made her throat tighten with an emotion she had not felt in months. "I am sorry," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can work to pay you back. I can clean or mend or whatever you need. My husband, he died, and I have not eaten in 2 days, and I thought just a few eggs would not be missed, and I am so sorry." Thomas studied her for a long moment, taking in the hollow cheeks, the worn dress that hung loose on her frame, the bare feet covered in dust and small cuts. Something twisted in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced since before the war, when compassion had still come easily to him. He set the lantern down on a wooden post and reached past her, his arm brushing against her shoulder as he gathered eggs from the remaining nesting boxes. Clara flinched at the contact but did not move away, watching in confusion as he filled an entire woven basket with more than a dozen eggs, their shells ranging from cream to pale brown. "Here," he said, pressing the basket into her hands with a gentleness that made her eyes fill with tears. "Take them, all of them, and come up to the house. I have bread and some cold ham from last night. You should not be stealing in the dark. You should be eating like a human being." "I cannot," Clara protested, even as her fingers tightened around the basket handle. I have no money to pay you, and I will not. I am not that kind of woman. Thomas felt his face grow hot at her implication. I am not asking you to be anything. I am offering you breakfast. There is a difference. They stood there in the henhouse, the chickens settling back into their restless sleep around them, and something passed between them in that moment. Something neither could articulate, but both felt with startling clarity. Clara saw in his face the same loneliness that had become her constant companion, the same exhaustion that came from facing each day alone. Thomas saw in her eyes a strength that hunger and hardship had not managed to extinguish, a fierce pride that resonated with something deep in his own soul. "All right," she said finally. "Just breakfast, and then I will find a way to repay you." The walk to the main house took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The Calloway ranch house was not grand by any means, but to Clara it seemed like a palace. It was solidly built, with real glass in the windows and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Thomas led her through the front door into a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, gesturing for her to sit at the heavy oak table that dominated the center of the room. "Let me cook those eggs," he said, taking the basket from her and setting it on the counter. "When did you last have a hot meal?" Clara's mind went blank trying to remember. "Thursday, I think. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house sometimes lets me eat the leftovers in exchange for washing dishes. But she has been sick, so I have not wanted to bother her." Thomas cracked 6 eggs into a cast iron skillet, the sizzle filling the quiet kitchen. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his movements economical and practiced. "You have been alone since your husband passed?" "Yes." "We had only been married 8 months. We came out here from Missouri, thinking we would make our fortune in California." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Instead, we found debt and disappointment, and then John died and the debts became mine alone." "I am sorry," Thomas said, and he meant it. He plated the eggs along with thick slices of bread and ham, setting everything before her with a formality that felt oddly touching. "Eat, please." Clara did not need to be told twice. She fell upon the food with an urgency that embarrassed her, but Thomas simply turned away to pour her coffee, giving her privacy in her desperate hunger. He had seen men eat like that during the war, after long marches and longer battles, when food became more precious than gold. He understood what deprivation could do to a person, how it stripped away everything except the primal need to survive. When she finally slowed, her stomach no longer screaming in protest, Clara looked up to find Thomas sitting across from her, his own plate untouched. "You are not eating." "I will. I wanted to make sure you had enough first." He paused, then said carefully, "I have a proposition for you if you are willing to hear it." Clara stiffened, her earlier wariness returning. "What kind of proposition?" "The honest kind," Thomas said quickly. "I need help around the ranch. My housekeeper left 3 months ago to live with her daughter in Sacramento, and I have been managing alone, but the truth is I am drowning in work. The house needs cleaning, the garden needs tending, meals need cooking, and I have cattle to manage and fences to mend, and a dozen other things that need doing. I can pay you a fair wage and you can stay in the guest room until you get back on your feet. Everything proper and above board." "Why would you do this for me?" Clara asked, suspicion and hope warring in her voice. "You do not even know me." Thomas considered the question, really thought about it. "Because 6 years ago, when I came back from fighting in a war I did not understand, I had nothing. A man I had never met gave me a job on his ranch, taught me everything he knew, and when he died 2 years later, he left me this place. He gave me a chance when I needed one. Maybe it is time I did the same for someone else." Clara searched his face for deception, for the hidden angle, but found only earnest sincerity. She was not naive enough to believe that all men were good, but she was desperate enough to hope that this one might be. I accept, but I want it understood that this is employment, nothing more. Nothing more, Thomas agreed, something that might have been disappointment flickering across his features before he masked it. You can start today if you want. I will ride into town later and settle up whatever debts you have. You can pay me back from your wages. I cannot let you do that, Clara protested, but Thomas was already shaking his head. Consider it an advance on your salary. I assume you have a landlord who is not going to take kindly to you disappearing. Clara thought of Mr. Finnegan and his increasingly aggressive demands for rent, the way he stood too close when he spoke to her, the threats he had begun making about alternative forms of payment. Yes, he is owed 3 months' rent, $30. Thomas did not flinch at the amount, though Clara saw his jaw tighten slightly. I will take care of it. Why do you not rest here for a bit, and then I will take you to collect your things? Not that you should be walking around San Jose alone at this hour anyway. The sun was fully up by the time they made their way back into town in Thomas's wagon, the streets beginning to fill with early morning activity. Clara sat beside him on the wooden bench, acutely aware of his presence, the solid warmth of him, the easy confidence with which he handled the reins. She found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking, noting the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, the strong line of his jaw, the capable hands that held the leather straps with casual expertise. You said you fought in the war, she ventured, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Where did you serve? Virginia, mostly, then the Carolinas toward the end. His voice went flat, distant. I do not talk about it much. Some things are better left in the past. I understand. My father fought too. He came back different, quieter, like part of him never left those battlefields. Thomas glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. That is exactly what it is like. You put it into words better than I ever could. They pulled up outside Clara's shack, and Thomas felt anger rise in his throat at the sight of it. The structure was barely standing, with gaps in the walls and a roof that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. This was what she had been paying $30 for. This hovel that was not fit for animals, let alone a young woman alone. Mr. Finnegan appeared in the doorway of the main house like a vulture sensing opportunity, his substantial belly straining against a stained vest. Mrs. Sullivan, I see you have found yourself a gentleman friend. Perhaps you have been holding out on me about your ability to pay after all. Thomas climbed down from the wagon with deliberate slowness, his full height seeming to fill the narrow space. Mrs. Sullivan is in my employ now. She will be moving to my ranch today. I am here to settle her debts with you. Finnegan's eyes gleamed with avarice. $30 for the back rent plus damages to the property. Call it $40 altogether. Damages, Clara gasped. The property was falling apart when I moved in. I have damaged nothing. Now, I am not here to argue, Thomas said, his voice deceptively mild. I will give you $30 for the rent owed, not a cent more. And if I hear you have been spreading gossip about Mrs. Sullivan around town, suggesting anything improper about her character, I will come back and we will have a different kind of conversation. Do you understand me? There was something in Thomas's eyes, some echo of the soldier he had been, that made Finnegan take an involuntary step backward. Understood. $30 is fine. The transaction was completed quickly, and Clara gathered her few belongings, everything she owned fitting into a single worn carpetbag. A few dresses, her mother's Bible, John's pocket watch, and a daguerreotype of her parents. It was a sobering moment, seeing her entire life reduced to so little, but as Thomas helped her back onto the wagon, his hand steady and warm on her elbow, she felt something she had not experienced in months. Hope. The first weeks on the Calloway ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm that surprised them both. Clara threw herself into the work with fierce determination, scrubbing the house from top to bottom, beating dust from curtains that probably had not been washed in years, tending to the vegetable garden that had gone somewhat wild in the housekeeper's absence. Thomas found himself inventing reasons to come back to the house during the day, checking if she needed anything, making sure she was settling in all right, though they both knew these were merely excuses to be in each other's company. They took their meals together, at first in awkward silence, then with gradually increasing conversation. Thomas learned that Clara had grown up on a farm outside St. Louis, that she could read and write, and had even attended school through the 8th grade, which was more education than most women received. She loved poetry, particularly Whitman, though she confessed she found some of his work scandalous. She had married John Sullivan because he had seemed kind and ambitious, because her parents were gone and she was alone, because marriage had felt like the logical next step. Clara learned that Thomas had enlisted at 19, that he had seen things in the war that still woke him at night sometimes, though he did not elaborate on what those things were. He had taught himself to read using his late mentor's book collection, and he had a particular fondness for agricultural journals and Shakespeare, an unlikely combination that made her smile. He had never been married, never even come close, though he admitted with endearing awkwardness that he had courted a girl briefly before the war, but she had married someone else while he was gone. Did you love her? Clara asked one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas considered the question. I thought I did at the time, but looking back, I think I loved the idea of her more than the actual person. She was pretty and smiled at me, and I was 19 and stupid. Real love, I think, is something different, something deeper. What do you think real love is? Clara asked softly, not looking at him. I think it is seeing someone at their worst and not running away. I think it is wanting to make their life easier just because making them happy makes you happy too. I think it is finding someone whose presence feels like home. He paused, then added quietly, I think it is what I am starting to feel for you, though I know I should not say such things. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had felt it too, this growing connection between them, the way her heart lifted whenever she heard his footsteps on the porch, the way she found herself listening for his voice, watching for his smile. It terrified her because it had been less than a year since John died, and she worried what people would think, what it meant about her character if she could develop feelings for another man so quickly. Thomas, she began, but he held up a hand. You do not have to say anything. I know it is too soon. I know you are still grieving your husband, and I know you are dependent on me for your livelihood, which makes this complicated. I just needed to be honest with you. I will not press you or make you uncomfortable. I just wanted you to know. It does not feel too soon, Clara admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. And that makes me feel guilty, because what kind of wife forgets her husband so quickly? But the truth is, Thomas, my marriage to John was not some great love story. We were kind to each other, and we tried to make it work, but we were still practically strangers when he died. What I feel when I am with you is different from anything I felt with him. It is bigger and scarier and more real, and I do not know what to do with it. Thomas reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. We do not have to do anything with it right now. We can just let it be, let it grow, see where it takes us. All right, Clara whispered, we will let it grow. And grow it did, through the long summer months that followed. Thomas taught Clara to ride, patiently guiding her through the basics until she could manage a gentle mare with growing confidence. They rode out together to check on the cattle, and he showed her the boundaries of his property, the creek that ran through the eastern pasture, the stand of oak trees where he sometimes went when he needed to think. Clara began making improvements to the house beyond simple cleaning, using her wages to buy fabric for new curtains, planting flowers around the porch, slowly transforming the bachelor quarters into something that felt like a home. The people of San Jose watched their developing relationship with interest and, inevitably, judgment. Widow Sullivan taking up residence with Bachelor Calloway raised eyebrows and prompted whispered conversations at church and in the general store. Clara felt the weight of those stares and whispers, but Thomas seemed unbothered by them, meeting any direct questions with calm assurance that Mrs. Sullivan was his housekeeper and their arrangement was entirely proper. "Thank you very much for your concern." But propriety became harder to maintain as their feelings deepened. There were moments of accidental intimacy that left them both flustered and wanting. The brush of hands when passing dishes at dinner. The time Clara stumbled on the porch steps and Thomas caught her, his arms around her waist, their faces inches apart for a breathless moment before he carefully set her on her feet. The evening she found him reading in the parlor and perched on the arm of his chair to see what book he had chosen, her shoulder pressing against his, the scent of her lavender soap making his head swim. It was Clara who finally broke the careful distance they had been maintaining. 3 months after she had come to work for him, on a warm September evening, she found Thomas in the barn tending to a mare who was close to foaling. He was speaking softly to the nervous horse, his voice low and soothing, and Clara stood in the doorway watching him with her heart in her throat. "Thomas," she said, and he turned to her with that smile that never failed to make her pulse quicken. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He moved toward her, concern crossing his features. "Is everything all right? I love you," she said simply. "I know it is complicated, and I know people will talk, but I love you, and I need you to know that. I need you to know that this is not gratitude or convenience or desperation. This is real." Thomas crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her eyes burn with tears. "Clara, I have loved you since the morning I found you in the henhouse, looking so fierce and so frightened. I have loved you every day since. I will love you every day for the rest of my life if you will let me." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will let you." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the chaste pecks John had given her, brief and perfunctory. This was something entirely different, a deep claiming that left her dizzy and clinging to his shoulders, her entire body awakening to sensations she had never experienced. Thomas kissed her like she was precious and essential, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt fundamentally changed. "Marry me," Thomas said, his forehead pressed to hers. "I know we should wait longer, should care more about what people think, but I do not want to wait. I want you to be my wife. I want to build a life with you, a real life. Marry me, Clara." "Yes," she said again, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small Catholic church on the edge of San Jose. Clara wore a new dress that Thomas had insisted on buying her, a lovely blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and she carried wildflowers from the ranch. A handful of Thomas's neighbors attended, along with Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, who had recovered from her illness and wept openly throughout the entire service. If anyone thought the courtship had been too brief or the circumstances questionable, they kept those opinions to themselves in the face of the obvious love that shone from both bride and groom. The wedding night was a revelation for Clara. John had approached their marital relations with hasty efficiency, treating it as a duty to be completed quickly and in the dark. Thomas approached her with patience and tenderness, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. He lit candles so they could see each other, and when Clara grew shy, he kissed her worries away, showing her with hands and mouth and whispered words that this was something to be savored, not endured. By the time the candles had burned low, Clara understood for the first time what it meant to truly be with someone, body and soul intertwined. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. The ranch demanded constant attention, and there were times when Thomas worked from before dawn until after dark, coming home exhausted and barely able to eat before falling into bed. Clara learned to manage not just the household, but also the financial books, discovering she had a head for numbers that surprised them both. She took over ordering supplies and negotiating prices with vendors, often getting better deals than Thomas had managed on his own. The whispers about their hasty marriage quieted when it became clear that this was a true partnership, not some scandalous arrangement. Clara became known in town as a shrewd businesswoman and a devoted wife, while Thomas gained respect for having the good sense to marry a woman who made him so obviously happy. They attended church on Sundays, contributed to community fundraisers, and slowly built a network of genuine friendships. When Clara discovered she was pregnant the following spring, they were both overjoyed and terrified in equal measure. Thomas became absurdly overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than sitting still, until Clara finally put her foot down and informed him that women had been having babies while working for thousands of years, and she was not about to spend 6 months being treated like fragile glass. "I just worry," Thomas admitted, pulling her into his arms. "I could not bear it if something happened to you." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Clara assured him, though privately she shared his fears. Childbirth was dangerous, and she had known too many women who had not survived it. But she pushed those worries aside and focused instead on preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and setting up the small bedroom next to theirs as a nursery. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1884, after a labor that lasted 14 hours and left Clara exhausted but triumphant. Thomas paced the parlor the entire time, wearing a path in the floorboards, until the midwife finally called him in to meet his child. The baby was small and red-faced and perfect, with a surprisingly strong grip that latched onto Thomas's finger and would not let go. "What should we name him?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse from hours of effort. Thomas looked at his wife, pale and beautiful in the lamplight, and then at the tiny life they had created together and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Daniel, after my father. Daniel John Calloway, if that is all right with you." "John, for your late husband." Clara's eyes filled with tears at the gesture, at Thomas's generosity in honoring the man who had come before him. "It is perfect." Parenthood changed them both in ways they could not have anticipated. Thomas discovered reserves of patience he never knew he possessed, spending hours walking colicky Daniel around the house at night, singing off key lullabies that somehow soothed the fussy infant. Clara learned to function on minimal sleep, nursing the baby and managing the household, and still finding time to help Thomas with the ranch accounts. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than either had imagined possible. Daniel was 6 months old when the drought hit. The summer of 1884 was brutally hot and dry, with week after week passing without rain. The creek that ran through the eastern pasture dried to a trickle, then disappeared entirely. The grass turned brown and brittle, and Thomas was forced to buy hay at inflated prices to keep the cattle fed. Their savings, which had been growing steadily, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. "We might have to sell off some of the herd," Thomas said one evening, his face drawn with worry as he reviewed the account books. "I hate to do it, but we need to be realistic about what we can afford to feed through the winter if this drought continues." Clara came to stand behind him, her hands on his shoulders, kneading the tense muscles there. "We will figure it out. We have faced hard times before. We will face this too." The drought finally broke in late September, blessed rain falling for 3 straight days, turning the parched earth to mud and filling the creek beds once more. They had been forced to sell half the herd, a painful decision that had set them back financially, but they had survived. More than survived, really. The crisis had only strengthened their partnership, proving that they could weather storms together, literal and metaphorical. The years that followed brought both joys and sorrows. Clara suffered a miscarriage in the spring of 1886, a loss that devastated them both. Thomas held her while she cried, his own tears falling silently into her hair, mourning the child that would never be. But they healed together, slowly, supporting each other through the grief, and by the following year Clara was pregnant again. Their daughter was born in February of 1888, a healthy baby girl with Clara's green eyes and Thomas's dark hair. They named her Rose Catherine, and Daniel, now 4 years old, was utterly enchanted with his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and show her his toys, though she was far too young to appreciate them. The ranch prospered as the children grew. Thomas expanded the operation, buying adjacent land when it became available, building a larger barn, increasing the size of the herd. Clara's management of the household finances proved invaluable, her careful planning and shrewd negotiations helping them weather the economic ups and downs that affected so many ranchers in the region. They built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, transforming the modest structure into something substantial and permanent. San Jose grew and changed around them. The railroad brought new opportunities and new people. The town doubled in size, then tripled. What had been rough frontier territory slowly became more civilized, though it retained enough of its wild character to still feel like home. Thomas and Clara became pillars of the community, respected for their hard work and their strong marriage, known for their fairness in business dealings and their generosity with neighbors in need. When Daniel turned 18 in 1902, he announced his intention to attend agricultural college in Berkeley, wanting to learn modern farming techniques that could help expand the ranch even further. Thomas felt a mixture of pride and sadness as he watched his son prepare to leave, remembering the young man he had been at that age, heading off to war instead of college, his life taking such a different path. "He is going to do great things," Clara said, watching Thomas watch their son. They were sitting on the porch in the evening as they had done countless times over the past 20 years, though they had added a porch swing that creaked gently as they rocked. "I know he is. I just hate to see him go. The house will be too quiet with just the 3 of us." Rose, now 14 and every bit as spirited as her mother, called out from inside the house. "Father, can you help me with this mathematics problem? I cannot make it work." Thomas smiled and stood, offering his hand to Clara. Maybe not too quiet after all. Rose proved to be a gifted student with a particular aptitude for mathematics and science. Unusual interests for a young woman of her era, but ones that both parents encouraged. She talked about becoming a teacher, maybe even a professor someday, ambitions that seemed impossible but that Thomas and Clara refused to discourage. They had built a life together on hope and hard work, on believing in possibilities when the world said no. They would not deny their daughter the same chance to dream. Daniel returned from college in 1906 with a degree and a fiancée, a bright young woman named Margaret who shared his passion for agriculture and had grown up on a ranch in the Central Valley. The wedding was held at the ranch, a much larger affair than Thomas and Clara's simple ceremony had been, with what seemed like half of San Jose in attendance. Thomas gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about love and partnership and building something that would last. "When I found your mother stealing eggs from my henhouse 24 years ago," he said, his arm around Clara's waist, "I had no idea I was meeting my entire future. I thought I was just catching a thief. Instead, I caught the love of my life." Clara buried her face in his shoulder, laughing and crying at the same time, still embarrassed by the circumstances of their first meeting even after all these years. But when she looked up at him, her eyes were shining with love that had only deepened with time. Rose married a few years later, a young lawyer from Sacramento who treated her like an equal partner and encouraged her intellectual pursuits. They settled in the city, where Rose did indeed become a teacher, though she and her husband visited the ranch often, bringing their children to run through the same fields where Rose had played as a girl. As Thomas and Clara aged, they gradually turned over more of the daily ranch operations to Daniel and Margaret, though Thomas could never quite bring himself to fully retire. He still rose before dawn most mornings, checking on the cattle, mending fences, doing the work he had always done. Clara still managed the household with efficient grace, though she now had help from younger women she employed and mentored, remembering her own desperate circumstances all those years ago, and determined to offer others the same chance she had received. On their 30th anniversary in 1913, Thomas took Clara back into town, to the spot where her old shack had stood. It was gone now, replaced by a proper house, the entire area transformed by time and progress. But the henhouse, remarkably, was still there, relocated to the back of their property when they had expanded the ranch, but still standing, still housing chickens who provided eggs for the family. "You remember?" Thomas asked, his arm around her waist. They were both in their 50s now, their hair shot through with gray, their faces lined by time and sun and laughter. But when he looked at her, he still saw the fierce, frightened young woman he had found in the pre-dawn darkness, still felt his heart quicken the same way it had that morning. "Of course I remember," Clara said, leaning into his warmth. "You gave me the whole basket, you gave me everything." "You gave me everything," Thomas corrected. "A home, a family, a reason to keep going when some days felt too hard. You gave me love, Clara, real love. The kind I told you about that night on the porch, when I said it was finding someone whose presence feels like home. You are my home. You have always been my home." They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by the life they had built together through determination and faith and love that had proven stronger than hardship or doubt, or the judgmental whispers of small-minded people. They had created something real and lasting, a legacy that would continue through their children and their children's children. The ranch thrived under Daniel's management, incorporating new techniques he had learned in college while maintaining the values Thomas had instilled in him. He and Margaret had 4 children who filled the house with noise and joy, who learned to ride and rope and work cattle the way their father and grandfather had. Rose's children visited often, city kids who came alive in the wide open spaces of their grandparents' ranch, who climbed trees and swam in the creek and listened with wide eyes as Thomas told them stories of the old days, when California had been wilder and more dangerous, but somehow simpler too. Thomas passed away in his sleep in the winter of 1925, at the age of 69. He had worked on the ranch the day before, fixing a section of fence, coming home to dinner with Clara as he had done for 43 years. They had talked about spring planting and Rose's upcoming visit and the new foal that was expected any day. He had kissed her good night with the same tenderness he had shown since the beginning, had held her close the way he always did, and then he had simply not woken up. Clara grieved deeply, but not desperately. She had been loved completely for more than 4 decades, had built a beautiful life with a good man, had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. She remained on the ranch, tending her garden, playing with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories about Thomas that kept his memory alive. She died 3 years later, at the age of 67, sitting in the porch swing where she and Thomas had spent so many evenings together. Daniel found her there in the morning, a peaceful expression on her face, as if she had simply decided it was time to join her husband wherever he had gone. They buried her next to Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, under an oak tree that provided shade in summer and stark beauty in winter. The funeral drew people from all over California, a testament to the lives they had touched, the respect they had earned, the love they had shared so openly that it inspired everyone who knew them. Daniel stood at the graveside with Margaret's hand in his. Their children and grandchildren gathered around them and thought about the story his father had told so many times over the years, about a desperate young woman stealing eggs in the darkness, about a lonely man who chose compassion over anger, generosity over judgment, about a basket of eggs that became a marriage, a family, a life. She was stealing eggs, Daniel said to his own son, Thomas Jr., named for the grandfather he had adored. And grandfather gave her the whole basket instead. He gave her everything he had, and she gave him everything in return. That is what love is supposed to be. The ranch continued for generations, passing from Daniel to his children, evolving with the times but maintaining the core values that Thomas and Clara had established. The old henhouse remained standing long after it should have collapsed, preserved by each successive generation as a reminder of where it all began, of the moment when chance and choice and compassion combined to create something extraordinary. Years later, when great-great-grandchildren asked about the weathered structure, they were told the story, about the cowboy and the widow, about eggs stolen in desperation and given in love, about a relationship that began with an act of theft and became one of the greatest love stories their family had ever known. They were told that true love was not always grand gestures and sweeping romance, though it could be those things too. Sometimes it was as simple and profound as seeing someone in need and choosing to help rather than to judge. Sometimes it was a basket of eggs offered in the pre-dawn darkness, changing 2 lives and creating a legacy that would last forever. The story of Thomas Calloway and Clara Sullivan became legend in San Jose, passed down through generations, embellished and refined, but always maintaining its essential truth. That love could spring from unexpected places. That kindness was never wasted. That a single moment of compassion could echo through time, creating ripples that touched countless lives. And if you went to the old Calloway Ranch, now run by the 5th generation of the family, you could still see the henhouse where it all began. Still see the porch swing where Thomas and Clara had courted. Still feel the presence of the love they had built together, soaked into the very earth of the place, permanent and real as anything that had ever existed in this world. They had started with nothing. A desperate widow and a lonely cowboy, eggs stolen in the darkness and offered in the light, and from that impossible beginning they had created everything: a life, a love, a legacy that would never be forgotten. That was the real magic of their story. Not that it was impossible or extraordinary in the way of fairy tales, but that it was real. Two flawed, frightened people who chose each other again and again, who built something beautiful out of hardship and hope, who proved that love was not about perfect circumstances or ideal timing, but about showing up for each other every single day, in big ways and small. And it all started because he caught her stealing eggs from his henhouse before dawn, and the cowboy gave her the whole basket instead.